Father Fadi El-Hamsi is often at funerals these days. This one was different for his uncle, Ibrahim El-Hamsi, who fashioned gold ornaments and who was shot to death in his house in a Damascus suburb.
They killed him because he's Christian. They refused to have any Christian in Syria.
In a frightening turn of this war, Christians say they are targets of Muslim extremists who have joined the rebels, and targets because they sided with President Bashar al-Assad, who promised to protect them.
I'm not afraid. My uncle died. He's immortal now. I can be like him.
Christians were in Syria long before the Muslim religion even began. The first churches formed in Damascus almost 2,000 years ago. Now they are a minority, about 2 million in Syria, roughly 10% of the population. And with a fast rising death toll, more than 1,000 so far, 200,000 more have fled the country. One reason why Syrian Patriarch Gregorius III urged peace from all sides.
It is not the time to say who is in danger and to know who is the guilty. It's the time now to stop.
But the war grinds on. So this is what hit.
Yes, these pieces.
Out here, shrapnel hit Father Fadi's church after mortar explosions that killed 2. If the regime loses, aren't you afraid that many Christians will be killed? Massacred, basically.
Yeah, it will be.
You think so?
Yeah.
Why?
Because they don't want us here.
So they pray that this war will spare their community, their centuries of heritage, and now their very lives. Barry Peterson, CBS News, Damascus.
It's a life of fear, of insecurity, and of lack of future. We are divided like a kind of tumors. In every part, we have armed people coming and forcing civilians to live following their orders. And what they want is to paralyze civilian life. So there is no more shops. If you need something, you can't find a worker. And of course, you don't have nutrition, you don't have alimentation, lack of food, lack of fuel, lack of electricity, and this fear, because you don't know when it will be your turn to be considered as a collaborator. And we think that something is going wrong more and more in the general way of orienting this strive, what's so-called for freedom and democracy. I am not Syrian, but I have been living in Syria for today almost 20 years. Syria was under a kind of totalitarian regime, but not in only a way, a repressive way, but it was that all the decision would be taken by few persons. But there was security, there was food, education, and people were living, of course, not in a kind of that they would say they're thinking in a loud voice. Now, this totalitarianism is not good and it's obsolete. But if the armed insurrection is implementing another totalitarianism, which is maybe worse, because there is blood, they can behead you, they can cut your, last week in our village, they cut the fingers of a so-called collaborator who is native from the village. Then they behead him, and they cut him in piece, and they left him in the street where even children would see it. So this kind of acts of atrocities cannot help people to really believe that what is happening is a strive for freedom. The majority of the Syrian population, I say, is taken as hostage, and sometimes as a tool, as a mean, by these armed insurrection people. They come and they take place in the civilian areas. Why? Why you don't make your combat? We have a lot of desert. It is against international laws. But what really scandalizes us and leaves us in distress is that the Western world seemed to be encouraging this rise of sectarian violence just to topple the regime. We are against violence, and we are against justifying violence. You can't say that this man is killing another man and he is justified to kill him. Moreover, when through his movements he is putting in real danger and having terrible collateral damages to a whole civilian population which was neutral. That's what is happening in Aleppo. You know, we are responsible, and if we are not responsible today, but we are responsible toward the history. Once all those atrocities will be revealed, when you will see a family whose girl has been abused, or I have heard about collective abusing, whose son has been beheaded, whose father has been abducted. You know that there are thousands of people, you don't know where they are because they have been abducted. Sometimes they are bandits. They say, we are in the revolution, but they are bandits, mafias who come to ask ransom. Some others, they have like sectarian hatred. So they take this one because he is Alawi. They take this one because he is a moderate Muslim. So we don't know, it's a confusion, it's a chaos. And what really grieves us is that the international community holds a paradox. On one side they say with hypocrisy, we want peace, we want to protect the civilian population. They even want to intervene in a military way like in other countries. But on the other hand, they are funding and sending intelligence helps and sending weapons to rebels. Really, you don't know from where they come. We are working with our religious leaders, with Muslim religious leaders, with pacifists, with also a family leader, tribal leaders, to say that there is a third way. And the third way is a way of non-violence, but real non-violence. When there is no attacks and aggression, there is no motivation for any repression. Second, the civilian society in Syria is upset. And we are asking for human rights. Not only human rights for rebels, but human rights for the normal citizens who are caught in between. And we are asking also, why should the combats be held in civilian areas? For example, in Aleppo, those people, they came from outside. I have been talking with prelates, I have been talking with families. They don't know whom they are. They are foreigners. Either they come from northern villages, from Idlib, or from northern Aleppo countryside, or they come from foreign countries. What are they doing in Aleppo? Why are they doing? Why are they funded and helped and fueled with weapons? And why are they introducing themselves in between the civilian population? And then they say that the army is bombing civilian areas. Please, don't enter in civilian population. Don't enter in residence area. Go to the desert if you want to make your war. It is against human rights and it is against the Charter of Geneva. So I want to say to all who are looking at me, I am a Christian and I believe in God. I believe in Jesus Christ. Non-violence is the best way to get what we want, the non-violence. And in all good revolutions, you look at Gandhi, you look at Nelson Mandela, even you look here in Ireland, when you can stop violence and you can enter in a real path of dialogue, accepting the other. Sometimes you have to forget your interest. You cannot take everything. You forget your interest. We can arrive to a common ground. We can make a new social pact, you know. And I want to also to ask, let the Syrian people alone. Let the Syrian people alone. Leave us alone. You are not bringing anything else but death, fear, chaos, instability with your big declarations and with your big assemblies and also with your big powers. Leave the Syrian people alone. Enough, it's enough. Leave those people and stop funding weapons for rebels you bring from I don't know what. We are crying also because those people, they have a mother, they have a father, they are human beings, and sometimes they don't know where they are. And they think that fighting in Syria or fighting where they are fighting will open for them heaven and paradise. And this is alienating.
Islamist fighters in Syria are believed to be holding a group of nuns hostage, abducted from an Orthodox monastery near Damascus. They have reportedly been moved to the rebel-controlled town of Yabrud. The Pope has called for prayers for the kidnapped women amid demands from clerics and religious organizations to release them. Our Middle East correspondent, Paula Sleer, is following the story.
12 nuns and 3 of their helpers belonging to the Orthodox monastery in Malula are believed to have been moved to Yabrud. Now, according to Syrian opposition activists, this is for their own safety. However, we have heard from religious officials who said that the women were abducted by members of the Al-Nusra Front, which is affiliated to Al-Qaeda. Now, we're hearing from the Syrian Observatory for Human Rights that the fighters affiliated with Al-Nusra captured after several days of intensive fighting the old quarter of Malula, and several reports suggest and point to the fact that the fighters then entered this Orthodox monastery in the center of Malula. Well, the Pope is praying for the safety of the abducted nuns. At the same time, we at RT have been speaking with the International Christian Concern, who told us that they were very troubled by this incident and they were urging rebel groups to ensure the safety of these women. At the same time, they said that they put the responsibility on them to provide free communication with these women who have been abducted. Now, Muslim clerics have also condemned the abductions in the strongest possible terms.
We denounce their deeds and confirm that terrorism is a savage monster which wants to devour all religious and humanitarian values.
They came to kill and kidnap, kill Muslim imams and Christian priests and archbishops alike. They kidnap priests and priestesses. The events in Malula show a dangerous conspiracy which aims at putting an end to the role of the church in Syria, which they want to take back to the Stone Age, with continued sectarian fight all over the country.
I spent some time in the Christian quarter of Homs in Syria, where both the Syrian army that had recaptured the town as well as residents who are now returning spoke to me about what they feel is the targeting of the Christian communities inside Syria. And this is an issue that is of great concern to the international community.
And here's footage that allegedly shows another attack on a Christian monastery in Syria. Well, this is an Orthodox monastery north of Damascus. And you can see here that rebel fighters targeting the buildings, which then catch fire. Well, the opposition justified the attack, saying Assad troops were using the monastery as an artillery position. My colleague Kevin Owen spoke to Reverend Nadim Nassar, an Anglican priest in Syria, about the fate of Christians in the war-torn country.
thousands and thousands, hundreds of thousands of Christians were displaced from their homes. And a lot of Christians were killed. We still have 2 bishops missing from Aleppo. We don't know anything about them. And now another attack on the Christian community in Syria. And the world is watching.
Reverend, is it because the Christians in Syria are being specifically targeted, or just that they're getting caught up in the wider conflict? What's the picture?
I think they are being used by both sides as a political card, because the regime wants also to show that they are protecting the minorities, especially the Christians, and now they are begging for the international community to interfere, to release the nuns, where the rebels, they are turning the blind eyes to the Al-Qaeda and the Islamists to target specifically Christians. There is a systematic attack on the Christian community in Syria, and hundreds of thousands of Christians were displaced.
For more on the Christians targeted by rebels in Syria, as well as other developments in the conflict, you can head to our website, rt.com.
Yes.
Farhan, regarding the Malula attacks, there were images coming from Malula showing that the intentional burning of churches, which date back 2,000 years or more, and other places, sacred places inscribed by UNESCO as World Heritage. Is the United Nations doing anything to stop these or to influence the events there? Also, the Ahrar a new group today announced that they are the kidnappers of the nuns, the 19 nuns from Malula. Are there any contacts with this group, who probably are also in Lebanon, working from Lebanon?
Well, I wouldn't have anything specific to say about the situation of the detainees. What I can say on that is that the Secretary General has repeatedly urged for all those held in Syria to be released immediately and without condition. Beyond that, of course, we're aware of the situation in Malula and would argue that this is yet a further example of the need to halt all fighting in Syria. And that is why we continue to press for the parties to attend the January 22nd conference that we will have on Syria.
Today, the Syrian mission sent the Secretary General and the Security Council another letter naming or citing hundreds of terrorists who were transported from Libya, Yemen, and other places by Qatar and Turkey, and they were allowed to go into Syria, and they were helped and abated in carrying out terrorist attacks inside Syria. What's the Secretary General going to do about that?
As you know, the Secretary General has opposed any further militarization of the conflict in Syria, and he's called on all parties, including all outside parties, to halt immediately all assistance and arming of the various parties.
Do you consider such actions as against the resolutions which were enacted by the Security Council and the General Assembly?
Well, I think the Security Council resolutions are very clear in what they say, and we urge all member states to abide by the terms of those resolutions.
These horrifying reports come to RT from the town of Adra, north of the Syrian capital, which has been occupied by Islamist rebel groups. At least 100 people are said to have been massacred by the rebels, but as the Syrian army continues to liberate the city, that number is expected to rise. Our crew spoke to some of the survivors.
When dawn was breaking over Adra, the El Nusra Front and the Army of Islam gave a signal for their fighters to attack. They came in hundreds, making use of bad weather and the element of surprise over government forces. After fierce fighting with the Syrian army, the rebel factions achieved their objective, with the city soon falling into the hands of those who the residents of the city have dubbed the decapitators.
A friend of mine told me that he claimed he was insane in order to save his life and avoid the militants. They believed his story and let him go. He also said his children have been emotionally scarred from the savage acts they have seen on the road between their house and the places where the fighters gathered. People's heads were chopped off and the bodies thrown all over the road.
Slaughter everywhere. The eldest was only 20 years old. He was slaughtered. They were all children. I saw them with my own eyes. They killed 14 people with a machete. I don't know if these people were Alawites. I don't know why they were slaughtered. They grabbed them by their heads and slaughtered them like sheep.
Adra, an industrial town, is inhabited by thousands of workers and their families, who were all trapped when the fighters surrounded the town. Details of what happened there are still uncertain. We've only had leaks about massacres that have been described as the most gruesome since the start of the Syrian crisis.
Civilians told us that the workers of an Adra bakery were all executed and burned during the first hours of the attack. Whole families were massacred. We do not have an exact estimation of the number because we are unable to get into the town, but the number is high.
Syrian army commanders in the region decided to besiege the town and protect civilians by isolating them from areas where fighting is ongoing, a move seen necessary by the military, whose operation is not expected to be an easy one. Abu Talib Abu Hayya.
It saddens me to see that in these countries there are supposedly our allies, that they continue to persecute Christians. It angers me to see my tax dollars supporting regimes that put Christians to death for blasphemy against Islam. Countries that put to death Muslims who convert to Christianity, and countries who imprison anyone who marries outside their religion. I say no more money to countries that are doing that to Christians. There's a war on Christianity, not just from the liberal elites here at home, but worldwide. And your government, or more correctly you, are having to pay for it. You're being taxed to send money to countries that are not only intolerant of Christians, but openly hostile. Christians are imprisoned and threatened with death for their beliefs. In Pakistan, Asia Bibi, a Christian, sits on death row. Her crime, according to her, is that she dared to drink from a glass that belonged to a Muslim co-worker. According to the co-workers, they say she insulted the Prophet. In our country, we would refer to this kind of stuff as gossip, and it would get nowhere. In their country, this Christian sits on death row. Recently in Pakistan, a 12-year-old girl with Down syndrome was imprisoned and charged with a death penalty crime for burning the Quran. After weeks, she was released after a local imam was accused of actually sprinkling the pages from an Arabic book into the fire and trying to accuse the little girl. During the Iraq War, over 250,000 Iraqi Christians fled Iraq. Saddam Hussein was a brutal dictator, make no mistake about it, but his government was secular and therefore a relatively safe place for Christians. Christians, however, now fear the new government, the new Shiite government, worse than the Hussein government. So the government we put in place has caused Christians by the hundreds of thousands to flee Iraq to go into Syria. So now we have 1 million, 2 million Christians in Syria. And what's going on? We're talking about arming Islamic rebels that are going to be shooting at Christians. It makes no sense to me. Syrians have lived as Christians since the time of Christ. I have a friend of mine who has an Arabic name. He was in my wedding, but he's a Christian. And I asked him when I was in medical school, how long have you been a Christian? He said, well, a heck of a lot longer than you have. He said, we've been Christians since the time of Christ. There have been Christians in the Middle East for a long time. But what we have to figure out is what we're going to do. The Senate's attempting now to arm forces in Syria, many of whom are Al-Qaeda or their affiliates. They say they're going to vet this, but I don't think it's so easy. They do this out of a misguided attempt to stop the violence in Syria. But I think instead their actions will bring more violence and more persecution of Christians who have long been protected in Syria. Before the Arab Spring, Christianity flourished in small outposts like the Coptic Christians in Egypt. I'd hoped that the Arab Spring would bring freedom to long-oppressed people throughout the Middle East, but I fear that the Arab Spring is becoming an Arab winter. Today, Christians in Iraq, Libya, Egypt, and Syria are on the run, persecuted or under fire, and yet we continue to send aid to the people who are chasing them. While they burn the American flag and the mobs chant death to America, more of your money is sent to these haters of Christianity. Even if all of the atrocities to Christians were not occurring in these countries, we simply don't have the money to engage in this foolishness. We must first borrow the money from China to send it to Pakistan. While American soldiers spent a decade fighting to liberate Iraq, and while American taxpayers have sent nearly $470 million in aid, Carl Mueller, president of Open Doors, describes what is going on there as religicide. Before the toppling of Hussein, Mosul, a city in Iraq, was home to 75,000 Christians, but now the numbers dropped to 25,000. Christian homes are set on fire, bombs are placed in their cars, Christian families are receiving threatening letters to leave Iraq or be kidnapped or killed. It's clear that American taxpayer dollars are being used to enable a war on Christianity in the Middle East, and I believe it must end. Pope John Paul II spoke about a culture of death. He talked about a war of the powerful against the weak. As Christians, we know we must always stand with the most defenseless. I believe that no civilization can long endure that does not respect life from the not yet born to the life's very last breath.